He commanded an empire of 60 million people. He had absolute power over life and death, over war and peace, over the fate of nations. And every morning, before the dispatches arrived and the petitioners lined up and the world demanded things of him, he sat down and wrote himself a note. Not a proclamation, not a speech, a reminder, sometimes just 3 words, sometimes a full argument with himself that he clearly wasn't winning. The remarkable thing isn't that Marcus Aurelius kept a private journal. The remarkable thing is what he put in it, and what it tells us, 2,000 years later, that we apparently still desperately need to hear. To understand the Meditations, you have to understand the man who wrote them, and the utterly improbable situation he found himself in. Marcus Aurelius was born in Rome in 121 AD to a family of comfortable minor aristocracy. He was studious, serious, the kind of boy who preferred philosophy books to gladiatorial games, which in Rome was a bit like preferring library science to football. He was not supposed to become emperor. There was a man for that job. His name was Hadrian. Then Hadrian made a decision that would reshape history. He adopted a man named Antoninus Pius as his successor, but with a condition: Antoninus had to adopt 2 young men as his own heirs. One of them was 17-year-old Marcus. Just like that, a bookish teenager who'd spent his adolescence studying Stoic philosophy became the heir to the most powerful institution on earth. He didn't want it, we know this. He wrote about it later. He described being pulled from his studies like a man pulled from a warm room into a blizzard. He understood, with the clarity that good philosophy gives you, exactly what power costs. Antoninus ruled for 23 years, and Marcus served as his patient, diligent heir, learning, watching, waiting. When Antoninus finally died in 161 AD, Marcus was 40 years old. He accepted the throne. And then, in a gesture that struck contemporaries as either extraordinary wisdom or dangerous naivety, he immediately insisted on sharing power with his adoptive brother, Lucius Verus, joint emperors, co-rulers. The philosopher king, it turned out, was also a pragmatist. Here is the historical irony that gives the Meditations their particular power. Marcus Aurelius, the most disciplined, philosophically prepared ruler Rome ever produced, inherited a reign of almost continuous catastrophe. Within a year of taking the throne, war broke out on 2 fronts simultaneously. Germanic tribes pressed the northern borders along the Danube. The Parthian Empire, Rome's great eastern rival, invaded Armenia. Marcus sent Lucius Verus east to handle the Parthians. The campaign was eventually successful, but the legions came home carrying something worse than defeat. Historians call it the Antonine Plague. We don't know exactly what it was. Smallpox is the most common scholarly guess, though some argue for measles. What we know is the scale. Ancient sources describe 5 million dead across the empire. Some estimates go higher. The plague killed perhaps 1/3 of the Roman army. It killed Lucius Verus himself in 169 AD, leaving Marcus to rule alone. It tore through Rome cities for nearly 2 decades, recurring in waves, the way pandemics do. And while the plague raged, the Germanic tribes, sensing Roman weakness, launched the most serious invasion the northern frontier had seen in generations. Marcus, a man who had never sought military command, who had spent his adult life studying ethics and logic, spent the last decade of his life camped on the Danube, personally commanding armies in the field. He was not naturally built for this. He suffered chronic ill health, chest pains, stomach trouble throughout his reign. He slept badly. He grieved constantly. He and his wife Faustina had 13 children, only 6 survived him. This is the context for the journal, not serenity, pressure. The Meditations were not written in a philosopher's garden. They were written in a military camp, between battles, during a plague, by a man who was holding an empire together through will alone. The Meditations, a title, by the way, that Marcus never gave it, later editors supplied that, were almost certainly never intended for publication. The manuscript has no formal structure, no dedicated audience, no rhetorical polish of the kind Roman authors cultivated obsessively. It's written in Greek, not Latin, which itself signals privacy. Greek was the language of philosophy and educated intimacy, not official Roman communication. And the text is full of repetition. The same ideas appear again and again in different words, as if the author is trying to nail something slippery to the page, because that's exactly what he was doing. This is a practice document, not a finished argument. Scholars believe Marcus used it as a form of what Stoics called ascesis, spiritual exercise. You don't write the same reminder down 40 times because you've mastered the lesson. You write it down 40 times because you haven't. He addresses himself, sometimes gently, sometimes with naked impatience. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. That's the famous version. But read the surrounding passages, and you feel the effort behind it. A man who absolutely knows this is true and absolutely cannot stop himself being upset about things outside his control. The vulnerability is what makes it extraordinary. Here is the most powerful human being alive, writing to himself, "Stop being aimless. Stop letting your sympathies run away with you. Stop, stop, stop." The Emperor of Rome had to remind himself not to get distracted at meetings. We don't know precisely how the manuscript survived. It disappears from the historical record for centuries after Marcus's death in 180 AD and resurfaces in the Byzantine period, where it was clearly valued in educated circles. The first printed edition appeared in 1559, more than 13 centuries after it was written. It has not gone out of print since. So what does the journal actually contain? Let me give you 3 ideas, not as a philosophy lecture, but as live moments from a life under extraordinary pressure. The first is what Stoics called the dichotomy of control. Some things are in your power, Marcus writes, and some things are not. Your opinion, your motivation, your response, those are yours. The weather, the plague, whether the Germanic tribes cross the river tonight, those are not. The entire project of the Meditations is, in one sense, Marcus Aurelius trying to hold that line under conditions designed to make a man forget it. Consider his co-emperor and adoptive brother Lucius Verus, by multiple ancient accounts, was vain, pleasure-seeking, and not especially serious about governing. Marcus had no power to change him. What Marcus could control was his own response, and the Meditations are full of notes about not resenting people who behave badly, because bad behavior reflects their character, not yours. He was almost certainly writing about specific people. We just don't know their names. The second idea is the view from above, what Marcus called the bird's-eye view of human affairs. When anxiety closes in, he writes, try to see the whole picture. All the conquerors and the conquered, all the famous men and the forgotten ones, all the empires that rose and burned, from sufficient distance, what separates your crisis from the noise of history? He uses this not as a counsel of despair, but as a loosening of grip. The thing you're terrified of losing. Alexander the Great lost everything too, and the world kept turning. The third idea, and this one landed differently in a military camp, I assure you, is that difficulty is the point. Obstacles are not interruptions to the work, they are the work. He writes about this with real force. The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. He was paraphrasing a Stoic principle, but he was also describing his own life. He did not get to be the philosopher king in tranquil times. He got the plague and the Germanic wars and the treachery. Yes, there was treachery, we'll come to that, and the dead children. The philosophy was not there to protect him from all that. It was there to make sure all that didn't hollow him out. In 175 AD, while Marcus was on campaign in the east, a general named Avidius Cassius, one of Rome's most capable commanders, a man Marcus had trusted with significant military authority, declared himself emperor. He had been, by ancient accounts, convinced that Marcus was either dead or dying. Marcus was neither. He was very much alive, and now had to decide what to do about the man who had just tried to steal his empire. What he did not do is instructive. He did not order a purge. He did not execute Cassius's family. He wrote to the Senate explicitly asking that no senator be put to death over the rebellion, that Roman blood not be shed in reprisal. He set out with an army to confront Cassius, but Cassius was assassinated by his own officers before Marcus ever reached him. Marcus was reportedly disappointed. He had wanted to grant a pardon in person. His critics then and now have called this naive. His defenders call it the single most extraordinary act of political self-restraint in Roman history. The Meditations contain passages that feel, and scholars have noted this, as if they were written in direct response to this moment. Notes about not needing the approval of men who will betray you, about forgiving injury as a rational act, not a sentimental one, about the fact that people who do you wrong are following their own nature, and your nature should be better. He never names Cassius, he never names anyone, but the heat in certain passages is unmistakable. The private journal was doing its job, processing the unbearable in real time and converting it into something livable. Here is the commercial fact that should stop you cold. The Meditations, a private journal written by a Roman emperor in the 2nd century AD for an audience of exactly one, currently outsells the majority of books published in the last 5 years. It has never, in the entire history of the printing press, gone out of print. Why? The easy answer is that the Stoic revival of the last 2 decades, fueled partly by Tim Ferriss, partly by Ryan Holiday's translations and commentary, partly by the simple anxiety of modern life, has put Marcus Aurelius back in cultural circulation. That's true, but it doesn't explain the deeper persistence. Modern self-help, at its worst, promises transformation. It says, follow these 7 steps and you will become the optimized, disciplined, serene version of yourself. The implicit contract is that the difficulty will end. You will arrive. Marcus Aurelius makes no such promise. He doesn't arrive. He keeps falling short and writing himself another note. The Meditations don't offer a destination. They offer a practice, the same practice, repeated, imperfect, real. And that honesty, the honesty of a man who has everything the world can give and is still having to talk himself down every morning, is profoundly, stubbornly comforting. It also helps that he was genuinely in extremis. When Marcus writes about not fearing death, he is writing it during a plague that has killed millions of his subjects and several of his children. The philosophy is not theoretical. It has been tested. And the fact that it held that this man governed justly, maintained order, showed mercy, kept his head, gives the ideas a credibility that no seminar can manufacture. Gibbon, writing in the 18th century, called the Age of the Antonines, the period that ends with Marcus, the time in human history in which the condition of the human race was most happy and prosperous. That may be romantic, but the fact that the most disciplined, reflective emperor Rome produced died not of assassination or coup, but in bed, of natural causes, after a reign of nearly 20 years, is at least some evidence that the philosophy was operationally useful. Marcus Aurelius died in March of 180 AD. He was 58 years old. He was on campaign, as he almost always was in the final decade of his life, near the Danube frontier, modern-day Vienna, by most scholarly reckoning. The cause was most likely illness, possibly a recurrence of the plague. His last recorded words, according to the Historia Augusta, a source historians treat with appropriate caution, it was compiled a century and a half later, were addressed to his officers. Why do you weep for me? Think rather of the plague and the deaths of all men. Whether he said exactly that, we cannot know, but it sounds, does it not, exactly like him. He left behind a son, Commodus, who became emperor and was, by most measures, a disaster, narcissistic, erratic, eventually assassinated. This is the part of Marcus's story that admits no consolation. The philosopher king, who had spent his entire adult life thinking carefully about virtue and governance, raised a son who undid much of what he'd built. The Meditations contain passages about the importance of raising good children. They did not help him with his own. History is often unkind that way. You can govern yourself beautifully and still not govern everything. This is, in its own way, the final lesson of the journal, and perhaps the most stoic one. Marcus did what was in his power, the rest was not. The journal survived him. We do not know by what chain of hands it passed through the centuries. We know only that someone, somewhere, in every generation since the printing press, has decided it was worth preserving, reproducing, translating, and selling. That is its own kind of verdict. There's a version of the Meditations that lives entirely in quotation cards on the internet, stripped lines floating over mountain photographs. You have power over your mind, not outside events. The obstacle is the way. Confine yourself to the present. They're not wrong, exactly, but they're the extract without the fermentation. They're the note without the man who needed to write it. Reading the full text rewards you differently. You feel the repetition, the same anxieties circling back, the same resolutions offered again because they didn't quite stick last time. You notice that Book 2, which many scholars believe was the first section written, has a rawness that the later books don't. You catch him being genuinely funny, in that dry, weary way of someone who has seen too much human foolishness to be scandalized by any of it. You also feel the coherence of a mind. This is not a collection of fortune cookie wisdom. It is 12 books, yes, 12. Someone organized the manuscript into sections at some point, of one man's sustained attempt to live well under impossible conditions. The payoff is not any single line. It's the cumulative sense that this can be done, that the daily grind of self-correction and recommitment is not failure, it is the whole practice. The Gregory Hayes translation, published in 2002, is the one most modern readers find accessible without losing the sharpness of the original. The Robin Hard translation for Oxford World's Classics is more scholarly and worth the effort once you've read Hayes. And because Marcus Aurelius has been dead for 18 centuries, every version of this text, in print, as an ebook, as a free file online, is yours by right. He can't charge you for it. He would probably find the whole idea of charging for philosophy mildly contemptible. The most powerful man in the world kept writing himself notes just to stay human. The notes survived him by 2,000 years. That seems, in the end, like exactly the kind of outcome a Stoic philosopher would have found both surprising and entirely beside the point.